So one of those nights, the lights went out. DJ Grandmaster Kaz and Disco Wiz were playing records in a park, and they had their equipment plugged into a lamppost, which was quite a kind of normal practice at that point. Then when the whole city went black, they were worried that they'd kind of shorted the whole of New York.
Just absolutely no fucks given about ripping off the Beatles, which I fully rate.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, if you and Tip, as the megalomaniacs in each relationship, want to think that, then go ahead and be my guest.
Hello, welcome back to Death with the Record. I'm here with Ollie, and this week we are taking on our first hip-hop album of the series, and that is A Tribe Called Quest, People's Instinctive Travels, and The Paths of Rhythm. Ollie, shall I just pass it over to you? The year was 1990. Do you want to get started with year in music?
Yeah, let's get going, man. I mean, as usual, we're going to start the podcast by just having a little look at the year in music. Was it a good one? Was it a bad one? The one thing about this week is, because we're going to be covering 1990 again in the that we have planned for a few weeks' time, I thought it would be a better idea just to focus on some of the hip-hop that was released in this year, just so I avoid repeating myself. And then after we've had a little talk through some of the albums, we'll of course try and apply a Rakim lyric that summarises the year.
Which is getting increasingly hard, by the way, can I just add?
Yeah, man, there's only so much you can kind of read about him gassing himself up and his rapping abilities.
Honestly, my opinion of Rakim has deteriorated the more I've had to do that fucking segment. Which is really sad, but please go on.
Anyway, so yeah, it was a pretty decent year, to be fair, especially for hip hop groups. So you got Public Enemy bringing out Fear of a Black Planet, Brand Nubian, One for All, Gangstar, Step in the Arena, an NWA EP came out. Run DMC as well, and our very own Eric B and Rakim brought out Let the Rhythm Hit Him. But, despite it being a good hip-hop year, there was one song and one verse that I haven't mentioned that definitely left all others in its wake.
Oh yeah.
Easily the best verse in 1990. Probably the 90s as a decade, and
wow.
maybe even the best of all time, Jamie.
Jesus,
I'm wondering if you can guess what it is.
If I can guess what it is. So it came out in 1990.
Yeah, mate.
Fucking hell. And a particular verse. Have I got any hints you could possibly give me?
Do you know what? I think
the best thing
to do might just be to play it to
Alright, I'm looking forward to this. What's coming?
So yeah, enjoy this.
You got to hold and give. Do it at the right time. You can be slow or fast, but you must get to the line. They'll always hit you and hurt you. Defend and attack. There's only one way to beat them. Get round the back. Catch me if you can, 'cause I'm the England man. And what you're looking at is the master plan. We ain't no hooligans. This ain't a football song. 3 lions on my chest. I know we can't go wrong.
I wasn't expecting that.
What are we thinking about that?
I mean, definitely best verse of the decade, and quite possibly of all time. Maybe the best track of all, best feature of all time.
Yeah, basically. Anyway, I was kind of trying to find a Rakim lyric about football or about crying on a pitch, to shout out Gaza.
Nice.
But I unfortunately couldn't find anything. So mine's actually taken from a song that was released in the 1990 Eric B and Rakim album, and it's taken from a song called Step Back. And I think it summarises quite well just how revolutionary and unique A Tribe Called Quest, but especially their leader Q-Tip, were at this moment in time. They'd obviously go on to release classic albums in the 1990s and become like a huge force in hip hop. So yeah, my bar is.
My beats the original, you can't find these. 89 is mine, so it's the 90s.
Nice. I mean, I already can tell you, I think you've won this.
Really?
I mentioned earlier, I'm finding it increasingly hard to find good bars and then relate them to. I'm just kind of scrolling through Genius, and it's not really coming. But my one this week is from All Night Long. Obviously, we were talking about hip-hop groups earlier. I think Tribe are up there as one of the greatest hip-hop groups of all time. So the bar from All Night Long is the
world's most hated hip-hop's elite. You obsolete, you cannot compete.
I mean, I don't know. I'm kind of glitching at straws maybe slightly. I think you take that one.
Yeah, it's not terrible.
It's not terrible.
I'm gonna take that one as a W for me though.
Yeah, you can have the dub.
Nice one. I mean, yeah, not to completely derail the conversation or the episode 4 or 5 minutes in, but I do think it's interesting noting just how many hip hop groups there were in the 90s as compared to now. It seems like a trend that's kind of disappeared a little bit, because I mean, even in addition to the 6 or 7 that I've just mentioned, around this time you had like Outkast, De La Soul, Digital Planets, Jurassic 5, Far Side, you know, Mobb Deep, there's many more.
Cypress Hill, Black Moon, Slumber.
And I don't know, I feel like these days when you think of hip hop groups, you maybe think of like ASAP Mob, maybe Migos,
Odd Future.
It seemed. Oh yeah, Odd Future's not a bad example actually, but it just feels like, you know, something that's disappeared slightly. Are there any reasons off the top of your head you think why that might be?
I mean, do you think maybe it's just a case that it's easier to market like an individual rapper than it is compared to a group these days? Like if you think about what happened in kind of the mid 90s and then into the late 90s, early 2000s, like Jay-Z and Nas were like the two biggest rappers in the world. It was when NWA, or the members of NWA, started to establish solo careers as individual rappers. Do you think maybe it's just a case of that groups became a bit of a, you know, just less cool than all these individuals who are rapping? Like, does that make sense, perhaps? I don't know.
Maybe.
I mean, I think the other thing as well is like a lot of the groups we just mentioned, like, are they strictly hip-hop groups? They're mainly like a producer and a rapper working together, like Eric B and Rakim. The thing about that is that... Yeah, or like exactly. Like these days, like, can you imagine like Drake and 40, instead of just being Drake, they were named a group and they were like an artist? Because that would be the equivalent. So I'm not sure.
That's an interesting point.
One thing I will briefly mention on the topic of groups. So a couple of years ago, Jalen and Jacoby of ESPN, Jalen Rose of basketball fame, did like a hip-hop group bracket, like a Final Four bracket, where there was kind of all the greatest hip-hop groups of all time kind of going against each other, duking it out. Then the Final Four ended up being Tribe, Outkast, Wu-Tang Clan, and NWA. And then I think the final 2 was Outkast and Wu-Tang. We will put that bracket up on our socials this week for you guys to have a look at and see whether you think they got it right. But I was a bit shocked that Tribe got booted out of 4 and didn't even make it to the final. But anyway, should we move on to the album?
Yeah, let's go, mate.
So, obviously, most important bit, it is the music. I wanted to open up the discussion about this album with a focus on the actual name of the album. So, People's Instinctive Travels and the Paths of Rhythm. So, a lot of the ideas I'm about to discuss are touched on in Hanif Abdul-Rakib's book, Go Ahead in the Rain, which I'm sure we'll be mentioning more than once today. So, if you're going to bear with me, Ollie, first of all, I wanted to return back some years to the Southern American states during slavery, when black African slaves were literally banned from having access to drums and other instruments because white slave owners feared that it would help them kind of mobilize against them and stir up dissent. So as a result of that, kind of the African rhythms and musical practices that they had were passed down through generations, either for using their own voices or using the sound you could generate from drumming on your own body, for example. So if we skip ahead quite a while from this, along this, if you'll let me say, path of rhythm, to 1997 in New York, around the advent of hip-hop. So obviously this time, as with any kind of origin story, or, you know, there's a lot of mythology, there's all these mythic stories about particular street parties that led to hip-hop and particular moments and how they all directly correlate to how the genre developed. Like maybe some of those stories aren't strictly true, or they didn't happen exactly in the way that they're often recounted. But as far as I'm concerned, I don't think that matters for the purposes of this. They still reveal something about that period of time and how the genre of hip-hop conceives itself and you know, how the paths of rhythm fit into that. So anyway, that summer 1997, it's really, really wildly hot in New York, and there's lots of power shortages going over around the city, and the lights would be going out. So one of those nights, the lights went out. DJ Grandmaster Kaz and Disco Wiz were playing records in a park, and they had their equipment plugged into a lamppost, which was quite a kind of normal practice at that point. Then when the whole city went black, they were worried that they'd kind of shorted the whole of New York. But anyway, as a consequence of the power going out, there were some riots and looting in the city, and DJ Grandmaster Kaz himself went to his local hi-fi store where everyone was breaking in and stole a mixer. Obviously, this had the direct consequence of leading to further integration of microphones, being able to mix two or more records together more easily, and then supposedly from that, the beginnings of hip-hop emerged as we know it today. So I'm bringing this up for a couple of reasons. Firstly, to highlight how black music has always been criminalised by white people, but also to show how A Tribe Called Quest positioned themselves in this like path of rhythm and how they took on that mantle. You know, there's a great moment in the Tribe documentary where Tip talks about how they would make beats in their high school just by banging on the drums. They're clearly aware of like the legacy of African American music and how that works. Ollie, Q-Tip was 20 years old when this album came out. He was, in fact, he turned 20 the day this album came out, and he was clearly already thinking on like a super conceptual level about his music. I guess my question is, do you think you can like hear that reflected in this album?
Yeah, I think so. I think this album stands out even now as something sonically unique and creative. So you can only imagine what the reaction must have been like 30 years ago when it dropped. I think just the amount of weird sounds and strange noises is what boggles me slightly. Like, who else in 1990, apart from Q-Tip, was going to be using a chorus of frog noises on a hip hop album? And I think it's tied to something that I've read from him in the last few years, that when he was making the album, he said that he wanted to make something as close as possible to the Beatles, to Sly and the Family Stone, Earth, Wind and Fire, as was possible for hip hop. And I think for a 20-year-old to have that kind of ambition is stunning. But then this album kind of matches up to those groups in terms of the experimentation.
Yeah.
Like the scale to some of the tracks, like the frog noises, for example, I think that's on After Hours.
Yeah.
But even in that song, there's these like huge timpani drums that just sound like cinematic would be like a good way to describe it.
Yeah, I mean, the experimentation in this album, like how psychedelic it is as well, talking about the Beatles influence and him saying he wanted to make a Beatles album. Like he's kind of succeeded on those grounds. And
then all those, all the kind of strange, dreamy interludes that the album's connective tissue, like they're super psychedelic. I guess they're kind of like hip hop skits, but rather than your kind of classic gangster rap chat about girls or money or guns, you've just got Jerobi White kind of speaking about the other members of A Tribe Called Quest and other kind of mysterious musings about space and sound and rhythm and all this kind of stuff. Yeah. I mean, to be fair, like, as experimental and psychedelic as this album is, like there are lots of parts of it are really quite melodic and catchy at the same time, which I reckon is probably down to the samples that they've used, or the old jazz, funk and soul records that Q-Tip had obviously poured over. Do you have a favourite sample on the record, Al? I'm not saying this is one is my favourite musically, but one of my favourite moments of the album is at the beginning of Look of Lucien, and Tip samples the French national anthem, Le Marseillaise. I think I'm saying that right.
Probably not.
And funnily enough, that's also used at the start of the Beatles track, Love Is All You Need. Yeah. But then, unlike that track, there's just a kind of banging hip-hop beat that comes straight in after this grand orchestral opening. And the thing is, I know the song is about a French rapper and he's referencing that through using the French national anthem. But he must have known what he was doing when he started the song with that sample.
Oh, 100%.
Kind of showing his vision, showing the like cockiness, arrogance of youth. Just absolutely no fucks given about ripping off the Beatles, which I fully rate.
Yeah.
But then I think from a music point of view, there's an Earth, Wind and Fire sample on Mr. Mohammed. And I just love the way that song kind of cuts back to the sample as a kind of chorus. And I think in a nutshell, that song and that sample specifically just demonstrate how on this album, the music can literally just go anywhere and you'll be going along quite nicely. And suddenly Q-Tip will just completely pull the rug out from underneath you and just chuck you down a rabbit hole.
Yeah. I mean, I think like the sampling, the sampling on this album, the way it kind of goes all over the place, it aligns to what we were saying earlier about like the paths of rhythm. Like he integrates the one moment there'll be this jazz sample, then it will suddenly like run to this funk or soul bit, and I think he's very conscious, Q-Tip this is, about like repurposing all the sounds that like an older black generation would have grown up listening to into hip hop. And it's worth mentioning that around this time, so the years 1987 to 1992 are broadly considered the golden age of sampling in hip-hop. So after that point, sampling became a bit more difficult. In the kind of late 80s, early 90s, around this time this album was being made, basically the record labels thought that hip-hop was this kind of, hip-hop will maybe come and go, there's not really necessarily that much of a commercial interest in it, so they didn't really give a shit about sampling. There's like a quote which I read somewhere which is saying it was virtually a free-for-all. So they would let any samples can go, Tip would sample whatever he wanted, and he'd have 6 samples in one song and that was whatever. The exception to that, interestingly, is Lou Reed. So obviously sampled Walk on the Wild Side in Can I Kick It. Lou Reed demanded 100% royalties and 100% publishing rights for that sample, which they gave him. So now that song, everything to do with that song, all the money has always gone to Lou Reed. Anyway, this changed in 1991. The Turtles actually sued De La Soul for using elements from the song You Showed Me, and then that lawsuit just kind of opened up the floodgates, and from that point on, samples had to be cleared. To illustrate how kind of bad and expensive it got for hip-hop artists or producers, on the album Midnight Marauders, 50% of the whole budget for the album was spent on clearing samples, which to me is that's just mind-blowing. From this album where it was a free-for-all, no one really gave a shit, to half of the budget going towards sampling, it's quite like a change, isn't it?
Definitely. In the tools of the people making the music, to have that just completely not locked off, but kind of narrowed so dramatically must have been, it's a massive hurdle.
Yeah, to be fair, sampling is one of those things that you can kind of see it from both sides, right? Like, I don't know that much of the details about how the actual processes of royalties and publishing rights and all that kind of mechanisms work. But there's cases in which maybe the artist sampling gets screwed over, but there's also lots of cases where the artist that is sampled also gets fucked over. Lou Reed notwithstanding.
I've been trying to do a bit of reading about this, and to be honest, there's a lot of websites that just offer like really boring text. So I'm going to try and explain this in a way that isn't completely crap.
I guess it's legal talk, right? Literally, it's these.
Ultimately, and so basically, if you want to sample a song, there's 2 things that you need to have. The first thing is the license for the usage of the master recording, which is often owned by the label.
Yeah.
And then the second thing is the license for the usage of the underlying composition, which is controlled by the publisher or the songwriter. And basically, if you're going to sample anything, you need to have those 2 things. And then the advance cost and the revenue percentage that you negotiate will vary depending on the sample and the song. And it can obviously vary dramatically. I think what you were saying there about the person being sampled, quite an interesting point to highlight the issues around this. Is one of the most sampled songs in music history is a 1969 track called Amen Brother by the soul group The Winstons. And basically artists have specifically sampled in that song what is now known as the Amen break. And it's basically just like a drum break that lasts about 7 seconds and was performed by the drummer Gregory Coleman. And this is one of the most sampled, even though it's 7 seconds long, it's one of the most sampled bits of music in history. It appears in thousands of tracks, from hip-hop to jungle, drum and bass, David Bowie, Oasis, The Prodigy, Amy Winehouse.
It is literally the basis for the whole genre of jungle, isn't it? Like, every jungle song, one way or other, features that sample.
But what's messed up is nobody from the Winstons saw any money from these songs, and Coleman himself, the guy who actually played this Amen break, developed a drug addiction and died homeless and destitute in 2006 in Atlanta. So there is definitely, I know it's easy to kind of be distracted by the appearance of like big monolithic powerful labels, but there is definitely a kind of human element to the people that perhaps don't get the financial help that they need when people are using their music.
For sure. I think the other thing is as well with sampling is like this. There's like sampling is not just, so for example in that with the Amen break, as you said, it's like literally 7 seconds of a drum break beat. But there's some samples where the whole fucking song is sampled to make another song. So I was thinking about this the other day. Yeah. Obviously, the song, the track "Final Credits" by Midland was, I think, was it 2016 or 2017? You could not go anywhere without hearing that song in London. Every house party, you'd have some bloke playing it on his aux or any night out. The other day, I can't remember what led me down this rabbit hole, but I was looking at who sampled the website for that track, and Have you ever listened to the original sample for that song, Al?
Yeah, I have, man.
It's literally the exact, like, not, it's like he's sampled it a bit and added some stuff. It is the exact same song, except Middleton's added that a cappella over the top of it. And it's just a joke.
Yeah.
Like, there's sampling a 7-second breakbeat and then there's sampling a whole song. I mean, it just makes you think about, like, you know, surely there should be some legal element of you're using the sample to this extent or that extent, you know?
Yeah, I think, loads of house music that's based on that kind of disco sound is basically just have a 4/4 intro that the producer's written and then just like slot quite nicely in like an extended clip of the song.
Yeah.
But this is the problem about sampling. We don't know what Midland paid for that. It would be really interesting.
I would love to know that, man.
To know that information. So if anybody out there can tell us that, then yeah, definitely get in touch.
But yeah, so how much money did the original artist make off what was probably the most popular disco house track of like the
last 5 years?
5 years. Yeah, that's super interesting. Anyway, just to move on and come back to Tribe, the reaction to the album at the time, you know, we love to bring up the NME on this show. For once, NME got it right. Ian McCann famously wrote that A Tribe Called Quest put no feet in the wrong place here. This is not rap, it is near perfection. So really strong words from the NME there. The other kind of notable review is from The Source, who bestowed this album with its first ever hallowed 5 mic rating, calling it a completely original musical and spiritual approach to hip-hop with sophisticated production invoking a jazz flavour. So just for reference, for people who aren't familiar with it, The Source, most hip-hop fans will know, is probably it's the world's longest running rap magazine, and it was a huge part of establishing hip-hop culture in the 90s and even into the 2000s as well. So to get the 5 mic rating from them in a review of an album was a massive fucking
Pretty
deal.
serious.
Yeah, in fact, so much so that there was only 9 albums in the 1990s that got that 5 mic rating. Before we move on to the Apex discussion, just to round up the discussion about the album, Ollie, you got some favourite tracks?
I reckon probably Benita Applebum would be my favourite on the record. I think it's probably one of the best Tribe songs, full stop.
Yeah, agreed.
But I think in terms of the album, it's quite necessary where it is because it's Tip kind of experimenting with his flow a bit more. I think the few songs prior to that are all quite repetitive in terms of meter and flow and everything's kind of breakneck, whereas I think it's good to have a slower one in there that just kind of breaks things up. And it's him at his kind of, when I think about Q-Tip at his very best, he is smooth, mellifluous. And this is a pretty good example of that, I think.
Seeing as this is the first hip hop album we're doing, favourite bar as well?
There's one. I think it might be on After Hours. I had the blues, but I shut them loose. A Jeep is blasting from the urban streets. Loops of funk over hardcore beats. The moon dabbles in the morning sky as the minutes just creep on by. Yeah. I do really like that song, actually. I think that's because obviously Q-Tip has a habit of telling stories on some of his songs. Like I Lost My Wallet and El Segundo, but I don't really like that song that much. But I think from a narrative, from a storytelling perspective, After Hours and that bar is really top. Yeah,
it's just kind of him walking through the city of New York, isn't it? It's amazing. I have to introduce, I know you've already mentioned it, but like we can't get away with not saying it. I think it's the second verse on Benita Applebum, the 38, 24, 37, you and me, hum, we're a match made in heaven. Like, I like to kiss you where some brothers won't. That whole verse, to me, that's like, that is Q-Tip approaching his very best. But yeah, do you want to move on to Apex, Al?
Yeah, let's get going, man. So as always, Apex imagines a situation where Tribe's career is laid out before as like a landscape with all the peaks and troughs. What me and Jamie want to work out is, where does people's instinctive travels fall? Is this Mount Everest, their best work? Or are people more a fan of Midnight Marauders, the Low End Theory? Maybe you're one of probably not many that prefers 1998's The Love Movement. So for those maybe not completely familiar with Tribe's discography, I'll just run through it very quickly. 1990 saw them release their debut. Only a year later, they brought out The Low End Theory. 1993 saw them release Midnight Marauders. 96, Beats, Rhymes and Life. 98, The Love Movement. And then there was quite a big gap to 4 years ago when they released We Got It From Here, Thank You For Your Service. Jamie, I think this week's Apex discussion is going to rely quite a lot on how each of us views A Tribe Called Quest and the importance of, you know, specific members in there. If there's one person that maybe we haven't talked about as much during this episode as maybe we should have, then I'd probably say it's Fife Dog, the 5 foot Safin, the 5 foot freak, Malik the freak, however you,
the freaky,
dog,
does it the funky
whatever you want to
diabetic?
call
Yeah.
him. Funky diabetic. He's not on people's Instinctive Travels very much. He's only on 4 of the album's songs. And my personal favourite thing about listening to A Tribe Called Quest is hearing Fife and Tip interact as MCs on a level playing field. And that just doesn't exist on this album. And I'm not going to make any excuses for Fife's contribution to this record, because Tip wrote all the beats, he wrote all the bars, he had to pull Fife into the studio to record. So this album doesn't reflect Fife Dog anywhere near.
It doesn't
his
reflect
best.
Fife Dog at all,
And,
really, does it?
Yeah, it doesn't. And I'm not trying to belittle Tip's immense contributions to A Tribe Called Quest, because quite simply, without Tip, there is
Yeah,
no
of
Tribe
course.
Called Quest. But I don't view Fife as just a kind of sideman. I see him as a really, really integral part of what I love about the group. And I think if I'm thinking about my favourite Tribe tracks, that's kind of reflected. Stuff like Bugging Out, Jazz, Check the Rhyme on the Low End Theory, Electric Relaxation on Midnight Marauders. I really enjoy when they split the MC work 50-50 and riff off each other and just work together. So I mean, it's obviously a massive cliche, but it does feel a little bit like yin and
Well, their
yang.
flows go together very nice. Their voices as well. You got like the nasally flow of Tip with the really high pitched, like Fife, like up here and he's down here. Yeah. I get what you're saying.
So as far as I'm concerned, this can't be the best Tribe album, because Fife is barely on it, and where he just isn't near his best. And for me, the Low End Theory is Tribe's apex.
Okay, so on this mountain range, is People Instinctive Travels near to? Is it near the summit?
Definitely.
Okay. I mean, so first of all,
Definitely.
before I kind of get into trying to respond to that, can we acknowledge the fact that, you know, Tribe in 3 years, from 1990 to 1993, released 3 classic albums. Even if you don't rate this one necessarily as much as Low End Theory or vice versa with Midnight Marauders, 3 years, 3 unbelievable albums, and a group made of people between the ages of 19 and 20, whatever it would have been, 22, I guess. That, first of all, is incredible. In forms of this debate around Tip versus Fife, as you said, Tribe Called Quest wouldn't exist in any aspect without Tip. He was the one who got everyone in the studio, he produced all the beats, he wrote all the lyrics on this album. Their studio was near Madison Square Garden, right? And he would have, Fife would be too busy watching Knicks games to even come to the studio. So we wouldn't hear any of Fife's bars, whether you like them or not, in later albums, if it wasn't for Tip. So we got that out of the way. I wanted to present you with a quote, Ollie, to kind of explain why someone like myself, who's just a huge Q-Tip fanboy, kind of sees this album as maybe not their apex, but the one that they enjoy the most or find the most satisfying. So this quote from Hanif Abdul-Rakib says, "Even if it is never explicitly spoken, most musical groups across genres are sold to us with a single genius at their centre. Everyone else in the group just adds to the canvas after the visionary has had his or her turn at it. This person is also the group's propeller, pushing them past whatever boundaries they thought they'd hit. The Beach Boys had Brian Wilson, A Tribe Called Quest had Q-Tip. I genuinely believe Q-Tip is on that level of Brian Wilson kind of genius, and he certainly shares Brian Wilson's fucking bizarre or lack of people skills, shall we say. As someone who loves Q-Tip this much, yes, I appreciate that on Low End Theory and Midnight Marauders there's more of that back and forth between Tip and Fife, but to me it doesn't really matter. Maybe this isn't the apex or necessarily their best or most significant artistic work, but it is the one I enjoy most. Like the fact that it's not as refined, it's a bit more chaotic and a bit more psychedelic. To me, that is why I enjoy it as much as I do.
Okay.
I would also... Sorry, go on.
I think the other thing that I want to mention is, even aside from Fife Dog's minimal contributions to their debut, I actually think, I can't speak highly enough of Tip's production on this album. Like, it's trailblazing, it's unique. So that's not of the question. But what I also believe is that as an MC and a rapper, Tip develops massively from this point in time. I think there's quite a lot of songs on this record where he's trying to speak at breakneck speed, and with his accent and his voice, sometimes that can come across as quite grating when he's just kind of yapping away in like
he's
a
not
nasal
fully got
voice.
into his Q-Tip style yet, as we came to know it.
Yeah, as like Mr. Smooth, Mr. Mellifluous, that he exhibits on stuff like Benita Applebum, to be fair. So yeah, I understand what you're saying, that you have like a soft spot for this album because of all the intricacies that you just said. But I think if we're talking about their best album and, you know, all of them operating at their peak, not even just Five Dog, then I think you're probably looking at Low End Theory. Maybe you could make an argument for Midnight Marauders as well.
Okay, well, something I do want to mention here for the listeners at home, how has you delivered that crushing blow and, you know, the grand conclusion of, oh, well, you know, Low End Theory, yes, and maybe Midnight Marauders. When we first met, Ollie, and I'm talking about the day or the moment we met, we had a conversation about Tribe, if you remember that. Do you?
Yeah,
so
I do, yeah.
You are the only person in the history of music who got into A Tribe Called Quest through the album The Love Movement. I explicitly remember meeting you that day. I remember you meeting me that day, and we were talking about Tribe, and then you start going on about Beats, Rhymes and Life and The Love Movement, and I was like, who is this guy? I'm not sure if he's on like another plane to me, like kind of Galaxy Brain take of like those are the two best albums. But you talk about how, you know, Low End Theory is this, and, you know, with all this conviction. You're fucking the first two albums you listened to for Tribe were Love Movement and Beats, Rhymes and Life. Am I wrong?
This is shameful. What's happened here is you've lost the arguments and now you're inventing situations. I got into Tribe Called Quest through Midnight Marauders and Beats, Rhymes and Life.
Beats, Rhymes and Life, yeah, exactly. And
the Love Movement since this week.
That's it's just not true. I don't know what you want me to say. Like,
we need to move on to Alternate Cut.
All right, before we move on, I want to finish this segment with one quote. So we've concluded that, fine, Low End Theory is the apex, whatever. This quote from Q-Tip will illustrate how I feel about moments like this. The hardest part of being in a group is constantly considering someone else. That's Q-Tip circa 2010. So that's how I feel about doing this podcast with you every now and again, Ollie. I am Q-Tip in this pairing, and you are Fife. Do you disagree?
Well, yeah, if you and Tip as the megalomaniacs in each relationship want to think that, then go ahead and be my guest.
You think that? I mean, fucking hell, megalomaniac. Jeez. Right, we're moving on. Shut Apex down. We're moving on. Right, next segment is, of course, alternate cuts. Usually, this is the point where we kind of examine some of the opinions critically or in the culture about a particular album, and we throw out our own alternate cuts or opinions on how they relate to those. This week, I don't think we're going to do that. We've spent the past 15 minutes talking about Fife and Tip, and it resulted in Ollie calling me a megalomaniac. So it's probably best that we talk about something a bit more lighthearted. So, having spoken about Tip and Fife, that is also ignoring two of the other members of A Tribe Called Quest and this collective, which are, of course, Ali and Jerobi. Having watched the documentary, the Michael Rappaport Tribe Called Quest documentary, those, Ali and Jerobi come across far, far better than Tip and Fife ever do. They both seem like genuinely very down-to-earth, modest, humble, kind, pleasant people. And I feel it's only right that we salute them for their part in the group. Now, Ollie, Jerobi, of course, famously left the Tribe Called Quest after this album to follow his dream and become a chef. So this guy literally left the greatest hip-hop group of all time to become a chef. But he's quite good at it, isn't he? Like, he doesn't seem to have any regrets.
That's the beautiful thing about him. He was following his passion, and there's that. Yeah, as you say, not really bothered about the group going on to achieve what they did, because he retrained and opened a restaurant. So yeah, big up Jerobi. Yeah,
you can go on YouTube if you want, and there's a video where he cooks a grilled lamb and plum confit and grilled fruit salad, and it looks really, really dank, as certain people would describe his cooking. Anyway, the point is, it got me thinking about when musicians have left their music careers and then, walked away from stardom to do fairly innocuous jobs. So Fife, as well, in the Tribe documentary, he briefly tries to make it as a high school basketball scout/recruiter/coach, and I mean, I feel bad for saying it, rest in peace, but it's pretty painful to watch. He doesn't quite have the talent for it necessarily that Jerobi does for cooking, but fair play for trying. Other very famous examples in music, Art Garfunkel left Simon and Garfunkel at their peak to go and become a maths teacher, which is somehow not even in the top 10 weirdest things that Garfunkel has done. I won't go into details, but just go on his website and click on his book list if you ever want to have a amusing 30 minutes. Garfunkel is a weird bloke. Anyway, I've come up with this little challenge, Ollie. So I have 5 musicians I'm going to name, and 5 jobs which these musicians have pursued after or instead of music. What your job is going to be is to match up the musician to the job, if that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, so some of these musicians I'm sure you'll be familiar with, some of them perhaps less so. So the musicians are JB Gill from JLS, I'm sure you remember fondly.
X Factor, yeah,
Indeed.
got that.
Russell Senior from Pulp, I know you're a massive Pulp fan.
Yeah.
Zian McCabe, who was the guitarist in the Dandy Warhols, if you remember them.
Okay.
Then Jeff Skunk Baxter, who was the guitarist for both Steely Dan and the Doobie Brothers at one point.
Okay.
And then finally Terry Chimes, who was the original drummer of The Clash. So we have JLS, Pulp, Dandy Warhols, Steely Dan, and The Clash, if you want to remember them that way. The jobs that I will present you with are as follows. We have a chiropractor, a farmer, an antiques dealer, an estate agent, and a missile defence expert.
Missile defence expert.
Yeah, so quite the variety from farmer to missile defence expert. So I guess your job now is to try and match up, farmer, antiques dealer, missile defence, estate agent, and a chiropractor to the ones I've just described.
So just off the bat, so is it John Skunk Baxter?
Jeff Skunk.
Jeff Skunk Baxter.
Of Steely Dan.
He sounds like a missile defence person to me.
Ding, ding, ding. Yeah, you're correct.
Yeah. Right, okay.
Steely Dan screams missile defence expert, doesn't it?
I'm going to go with JLS, JB Gill, farmer.
Yeah,
Is that
correct.
right?
How do you get that one?
Then we got Dandy Warhols, Clash,
and Pulp. And we have antiques dealer, estate agent, and chiropractor left.
Okay, I reckon Pulp to chiropractor.
No.
Oh, no, really?
You were doing so well as well, yeah.
Okay, Pulp to antiques dealer.
Yeah, Pulp could not be an estate agent.
Okay,
So
and then we have estate agent, I reckon Dandy Warhols.
Correct. Which
So
leaves
that means...
the drummer of the Clash became a chiropractor, yeah.
Decent. So 4 out of 5? Is that right?
With some kind of with some maybe some,
I guess it gets easier as you go along, really, doesn't it?
I mean, you kind of have to work backwards. This was my thinking, at least. Once you know that obviously Jeff Baxter's got to be a missile defense expert because he was in Steely Dan, then from there you can work things out.
Yeah,
I would have thought you'd say that JB Gill from JLS would have gone for estate agent, because JLS is a very, we've definitely met some estate agents over our time living in London who belonged in JLS, whereas Pulp
wearing suits from sheeny suits from New Look and things like that.
New Look man, what a brand. Yes, I mean that's alternate cuts for today. I'm not really sure we talked about anything particularly deep or meaningful, but
I think we touched on that earlier, didn't we, with sampling and everything?
We did,
so
and we've lightened the mood after our confrontation earlier. Yeah. So do you want to take things away for the final segment, please?
Yeah, definitely. So as always, we're going to end the podcast with our album cover Hall of Fame, and basically this just imagines a situation where the record cover is trying to get into a nightclub, and Jamie and I are on the door. Fortunately, we're not judging it on whether it's got a credible ID or the shoes it's wearing. We're judging it on some different criteria. Number 1, aesthetics. Number 2, originality. Number 3, harmony between music and artwork. And lastly, whether or not you can consider this to be an iconic cover. As with most kind of reputable doormen, there are different stages to our club. The highest level of Hall of Fame is GOAT, so straight in, no questions asked. Next level down is VIP, so it's very solid cover, good work. They'll have their own table. The next is ticket on the door, just coming in. Jamie and I feeling generous tonight. You've been queuing up for a while in the rain, you can come on in. And then the last one is name's not down, you're not coming in. That's embarrassing. Get out of my sight. Don't want to see you around here.
You're barred. You're barred.
You are, yeah, you're barred. So to get things started, I've got a bit of a confession to make on this one.
Go on.
So the album cover for People's Instinctive Travels, if you go on Spotify, the cover shown for this album
is the remastered. The remastered
it's
version.
The 25th anniversary edition, I think.
From 5 years ago.
Yeah, which is actually quite different to the original in that the majority of the newer version, or this anniversary version, is in black and white.
Yeah.
So I'd basically planned to make this big point about how the use of black and white ties in so well with the album and Tribe's impact on hip hop, because they're like a shot of colour and a shot of fun in a bland urban city, electrifying genre.
It's beautiful stuff. Beautiful stuff.
Yeah, beautiful. But then I realised that the actual cover has no black and white on it.
It's like it's all colour. Yeah.
Yeah, it just went out the window. No matter though. I really like the cartoon figures on this cover of the Tribe. It kind of reminds me quite strongly of Keith Haring's street graffiti from the 80s and the 90s, so it's very New York.
It's quite Basquiat as well, I find.
Yeah, definitely. And it just ties in quite nicely with the mysterious interludes that are kind of littered throughout the album as well, like who are these kind of 4 mysterious urban heroes, like characters.
Yeah.
I think there's probably parallels stylistically between this album cover and Beats, Rhymes and Life, if you're thinking about the kind of pan-African coloured cartoon figures in the midst of city life. But I think whereas the later record looks somewhat bloated and nightmarish, kind of strangely mirroring the group's internal problems, I think the debut seems kind of innocent and cheerful by comparison.
Yeah.
But ultimately, yeah, I just think it's a great album cover. I'm going to say I think it should be VIP.
Okay.
And the only reason I say that is because if we were doing, I'm not meaning to bang on about low-ended theory all the time, but I think if we were covering low-end theory, we'd be cracking out GOAT for the first time in the series.
Okay, so there's a lot to take in there. I think, generally speaking, Tribe are a great album cover artist or album cover group. I think, as you said, their first 3 albums, this, Low End Theory, Midnight Marauders, I think you could all individually argue that they are approaching GOAT level, in my opinion.
Yeah, definitely.
They have that really cohesive aesthetic across all their work, the Afrocentric colours that you referenced, the little kind of the stick man, and it's very cohesive. I think, will you let me make an argument for GOAT? Or do you think maybe like...
But I don't, because I feel like if you're going to let people's instinctive travels in for GOAT, then you by definition have to let Midnight Marauders and Low End Theory. And can a group have 3 GOAT album covers? Maybe
you're right. To be fair, Low End Theory is definitely the most iconic of the 3, isn't it?
Yeah. A funny aside, actually, do you want to know, can you guess which model Q-Tip originally wanted to have on the cover for that album?
For Low End Theory?
Yeah.
I don't... Was it Naomi Campbell?
Yeah, it was Naomi Campbell, yeah. Good knowledge.
The Bonita Applebum kind of figure. Yeah, that's interesting. One thing I will mention, that you're speaking of Tribe being a great album cover group, there are obviously some exceptions to that, or one particular exception. Your favourite album of the group's Love Me. That album cover is dire.
It's the worst album cover I've ever seen in my life.
Yeah, I'm not
even exaggerating. I don't think.
Is it worse than Stillmatic with the pigeon?
Yes.
Do you think it's worse than the pigeon? Okay.
Yeah. Because there's nothing funny about this, is there? It's just harrowing.
It's like, almost like, I can't believe this was the album cover, like Tribe with the same group that made this. It's like,
it just shows how badly things had become by that point.
If I said like the font reminds you of kind of like a poster you'd see for like a rom-com, do you know what I mean by that?
Yeah, like the holiday kind of vibes.
Yeah, it is the holiday. It is prime, like Jack Black kind of fodder, that album cover. It's absolutely awful. So should we go VIP then?
I think VIP's fair.
All right, well, in that case, into the VIP, have a table, People's Instinctive Travels. If we ever get to do Low End Theory, I guess we have our first GOAT album cover. Yeah. As of now, there's still not been a GOAT of this series. We'll see how that progresses, I suppose.
Definitely.
Like, subscribe. As always, please let us know what you think. If you think that I am the tip of this group and Ollie is the 5, let us know in the comments as well. And as always, we'll see you next week.